Well, now we come to the big elephant in the room, the federal budget and the outlook. And we're very fortunate that we have two people to talk about it who are really professionals, know the subject back and forth. First there's Bill Hoagland, now Vice President of the Cigna Corporation, but before that, he spent 33 years working in the Congress, the last quarter century, in the U.S. Senate, in a variety of staff positions connected with the budget. And I believe the most recent bill was working for Bill Frist when he was Senate Majority Leader as the person organizing the appropriations and budget material for him. So Bill is a pro. He really knows the subject in and out. And looking over the biography, I see he's known as a bottom liner who's not a hard liner. I look at that and I say, I wonder what that means exactly. And I decided it means that he knows where he's going, but he has common sense in getting there, or something like that. Anyway, Bill, it's great to have you here. And then we have Senator Kent Conrad, Senator from North Dakota. I might say North Dakota is now bringing the country a boom in oil using new techniques. And they're giving us the prospect of turning the whole situation around. And most recently, for the first time in 3 decades, the amount of crude being produced in the United States is taking an uptick. So, first of all, congratulations and thank you for helping our energy situation along. Senator Conrad is a 5th-generation North Dakotan, and he's now in his 5th term in the United States Senate. And during that period of service, he has won the respect across the board of everyone for the quality of his work and his persistence and professionalism, and has won this great respect. And now he is chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, so he has the action. Let me just set this problem a little bit for you by a few comments. You mentioned in the introduction that I was the first director of the Office of Management and Budget. That was back in 1970, 71, 72 period. And I remember I and my deputy, on behalf of the president, had an objective. And our sort of motto was, $250 billion is enough spending for anybody. That should be the limit. $250 billion, that's the limit. And we did bring the budget in almost right on that money. And now I look, and the deficit is 5 times that amount. The deficit, not the spending, the deficit is 5 times that amount. It seems impossible. So what to make of it? Well, let me just point out to you that when you have a deficit like that, the only way you can have it is to borrow. Right? You have to borrow. So who are we borrowing from? Well, for a long time, Japan, now China. Big magnitudes. And you have to remember that when you do that, you are giving China, in this case, a legitimate claim on our future. In other words, it's not a good idea as a long-run policy to do that. But that's what we're doing, in effect. So that's a problem. And then I look at the Federal Reserve and what it's doing. Recently, they bought 40% of the Treasury issues. 40%. That's monetizing the debt. There's no more accord. There's no more independent Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has moved into fiscal policy with this kind of action. What are they going to do? This debt, a lot of it is very short term. And then debt's being added. So you have to roll over the short term all the time, plus the additional debt. What's going to happen when interest rates go up? I said when, not if. The burden of the debt is going to soar. I don't think there's anybody dumb enough in the United States to accept the job of the next Secretary of the Treasury who's going to have to deal with these problems. It's horrendous. So we are building problems for ourselves that are big time. But there's still time to do something about it if we are able to take action, roll up our sleeves. And that makes me turn to our two panelists to tell us how.
Take that as an introduction. It'll go on automatically. You want to sit or talk? You want to sit or talk? It's up to you.
Well, honestly, I'm so depressed by that. Seriously, Secretary Shultz, I don't know if I've ever had the chance to meet you personally, but I've always had lurking in the back of my mind a question for you. Is the tattoo real?
I came in once to a Senate hearing a little bit late, and the chairman said, "Here comes the secretary, he has something on his hind." I actually have a no confirm or deny policy.
Okay, no confirm or deny. I am delighted to be here. I want to especially thank President Hennessy for inviting me. It makes it a little awkward for me because, as many of you know, I'm retiring at the end of this year. And when the Board of Trustees heard that, they called me. And I've not given any indication publicly of what I might be doing next. But I have been asked to be the next president of Stanford. I may have misunderstood the question. I was hoping President Hennessy would be here. Actually, the only commitment I've made is to be the offensive coordinator for the Stanford Cardinal. So I'm looking forward to that. I had a wonderful time here at Stanford. I was here as an undergraduate. And I came here, I was telling my aide as we drove onto the campus, I came here convinced I wanted to be in the United States Senate. And I'd actually, before I came here, written on the back of an envelope that I would run in 1986 or 1988, and I ran in 1986. So that's the power of a plan. So if you have children that are interested in becoming United States Senators, tell them to have a plan early. Part of my experience here at Stanford, in fact, listening to Jim Heckman was very interesting to me because I took a psychology class with the Bems, husband and wife duo who taught psychology here. And I remember very, very vividly, they're talking about a study that involved children as early as 5 years old. They started with them at 5, and I believe they followed them for 10 years. And they measured 3 categories: discipline, demonstrated affection, and stability. And then they followed what happened to these children through their lives, and it was phenomenal, just on those 3 measures. So a lot of what Jim Heckman is saying, I think I picked up on here in my years at Stanford. I also was very involved in what became the Stanford Prison Experiment. I don't know if you remember that. In some ways I was deeply involved because I brought Carlo Prescott to campus, who was really the one who was the inspiration for the Stanford Prison Experiments. He'd spent 20 years in the California prison system. He was an absolutely brilliant guy. And in fact, I think he was made a member of the Stanford faculty. I was told at the time he was the only one ever put on the Stanford faculty who had not graduated from college. So I was in Dr. Zimbardo's classes. In fact, I was a teaching assistant in Dr. Zimbardo's classes here. And spent a lot of time studying history with David Kennedy. I just had a wonderful experience here, so I was delighted to agree to come back. I'm here to talk about not psychology or not tattoos or not my future, but to talk about the future of our budget. I am delighted to be joined by Bill Hoagland. He was staff director on the Budget Committee when I was ranking member, and he was the staff director for the chairman, Senator Domenici. I've always had the highest regard for Bill Hoagland. He is professional. We're on opposite sides of the political aisle, but Bill is from the old school, and I guess I'm now of the old school as well, having served 26 years. You could fight, but at the end of the day, you could be respectful. And unfortunately, that is, I think, diminished now in the Senate, and that's a very serious loss, I think, to the Senate. People like Bill are really what we need. Let me just kind of put in perspective, at least from my standpoint, the circumstance we confront. I will never forget in 2008, in September, being called to the Capitol one evening, emergency meeting. I was asked to go to the leader's office, and I arrived, and there were about 15 members there, the leaders of the Senate and the House, Republican and Democrat, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Secretary of Treasury in the Bush administration, Hank Paulson. They closed the doors, they posted a guard at the door, and they then told us they were taking over AIG the next morning. They weren't there to seek our consent. They were there to tell us they were doing it, and they told us if they did not do it, they believed there would be a financial collapse within days. And they went into some detail as to the firms that they believe would go down in the ensuing catastrophe if AIG was allowed to go. I then fast forward, I remember being part of the negotiating team on the TARP. And the last night of those negotiations, a negotiation that went well into the morning, Secretary Paulson getting on his BlackBerry messages from around the world every 15 or 20 minutes of financial institutions that were going to go down that night if their governments did not intercede. And I remember being told at about 11 o'clock, if we did not reach conclusion by 5 or 6 o'clock Sunday evening, the Asian markets would open and they would collapse. Our own markets would open the next morning and they'd pancake. And that's a pretty heavy sense of responsibility. Now, some would say, well, we should have just accepted that and not paid too much attention to it. I don't know of any serious person that would be in a room with information coming to it that serious and having the leadership, the economic leadership of the country, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Secretary of the Treasury, telling you if you don't take action, there's going to be an economic collapse. But that is precisely the environment we were in. And I think we all recall 2008, 2009, the worst recession since the Great Depression. You remember the last quarter of 2008, the economy was actually shrinking at a rate of almost 9%. In January of 2009, we lost 800,000 jobs in a month. We had a housing market crisis, a financial crisis. We faced serious conditions everywhere we looked. Credit markets were largely frozen. I think we can all look back now and see we've come a long way. The federal response to the crisis, including the Federal Reserve, the Bush administration, who took the initial steps, the Obama administration and Congress, I believe, averted a depression. Now, if we look at the evidence, as I indicated, fourth quarter of 2008, economy shrinking at a rate of almost 9%. The most recent quarter, fourth quarter of 2011, 3% growth. Not what we'd like it to be, but a dramatic turnaround. Private sector jobs, as I mentioned, January of 2009, we lost over 800,000 jobs in 1 month. We now, today, just received the most recent month, 233,000 jobs created in the private sector. That is a dramatic turnaround. Again, not as strong as we would like, but a remarkable turnaround from the worst recession since the Great Depression. So, what do we need going forward? My own belief is we need an economic two-step. We need additional steps in the very short term to give additional life to this economy. But simultaneously, it is essential we take on this debt threat. We had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs say last year that the greatest threat to the security of the United States is the debt threat. And this idea of an economic two-step is not one just held by me. Chairman Bernanke has made it very clear that he believes that's important. I quote him in his testimony before the Senate Budget Committee this year. Even as fiscal policymakers address the urgent issue of fiscal sustainability, they should take care not to unnecessarily impede the current economic recovery. Fortunately, the two goals of achieving long-term fiscal sustainability and avoiding additional fiscal headwinds for the current recovery are fully compatible. Indeed, they are mutually reinforcing. It's a pretty hard thing to explain to people, I can tell you, in political life, that sometimes you got to dig the hole deeper before you start filling it in. But that's the circumstance that we face, I believe. In terms of how those investments might be made most effectively, I personally am a big fan of infrastructure. If we look at what we're doing on infrastructure versus our major competitors, frankly, we're falling behind. China, 9% infrastructure spending as a percentage of GDP. Europe, 5%. We're at 2.4%. And the great thing about investment in infrastructure, it's a twofer. Not only do you create jobs and jobs here at home, you also improve the competitive position of the United States. But undeniably, we need to act quickly and effectively on the debt threat simultaneously. And what I mean by that is put in place a plan now that takes effect as the economy strengthens. You know, if you kind of diagnose the problem, this is one of my favorite charts. We can go to the next one on spending and revenues. The spending line, going back to 1950, is the red line. The green line is the total revenues, again going back to 1950. And what's so striking is we are at or near a 60-year high on spending. We are at or near a 60-year low on revenue. Hence, record deficits, record increases to debt. My own belief is you've got to work both sides of this equation. If we go to the next chart on gross debt, we now see that the gross debt of the United States is going to be more than 100% of GDP at the end of this year. Now, that is not just numbers on a page, because the best work that we have, academic work, a book written by Ken Rogoff of Harvard and Carmen Reinhardt at the University of Maryland, looked at 200 years of economic history, 44 different countries, and here's what they concluded in their book, Growth in a Time of Debt. We examine the experience of 44 countries spanning up to 2 centuries of data on central government debt, inflation, and growth. Our main finding is that across both advanced countries and emerging markets, high debt to GDP levels, 90% and above, are associated with notably lower growth outcomes. Simple language, what they are saying is once you've got a growth debt of more than 90% of GDP, which is where we are right now, your future economic prospects are reduced. You have lower rates of economic growth, and pretty significantly so. So this is not just numbers on a page. What we're talking about is the future economic prospects of our country. And we have got to find a way to summon the will to take this on. Let me go to the next chart if we can. This is the Congressional Budget Office's long-term debt outlook. I've indicated we have a gross debt of 100% of GDP right now. This chart looks at publicly held debt. The difference is about 30 percentage points. So publicly held debt is about 70% of GDP right now. Gross debt, 100%. I use the gross debt numbers because that was the basis for the Rogoff-Reinhardt study. When they talk about 90% level of debt to GDP, they're talking gross debt. This chart looks at publicly held debt, and you can see, I mean, it's this debt, if we stay on this trend line, if we stay on this trajectory, is going to take off like a scalded cat. We cannot stay on this trajectory. We have to change. And let me just say, colleagues on both sides are in deep denial. On both sides are in deep denial. There is, I just don't even know how to describe conversations I have with some of my colleagues. But they are angry at me for bringing up what I think are uncomfortable truths. And these are uncomfortable truths. And when we look at the underlying contributing factors, discretionary spending, which is about 40% of the budget, that includes defense, it includes parks, education, all the things that are appropriated every year, about $1.1 trillion a year. You can see since 1982, the last 40 years, that's been on a downward path. Now, obviously, we've had a bump up with wars and a bump up with the economic downturn. But the long-term trajectory for discretionary spending is down. I really don't think that's where our problem lies. If we go to the next chart, Social Security, on the other hand, is a percentage of GDP. Looking back to 1972, going forward to 2050, you can see with the demographic time bomb, it is the baby boom generation, and that's not a projection. They've been born. They're alive today. They're going to be eligible. You can see going from 3.3% of GDP to nearly twice as much by the end of the forecast period. And the 800-pound gorilla are the health care accounts. That's the next slide. Medicare, Medicaid, other federal health spending as a percentage of GDP. This is the one that really, I hope, catches your attention. If you don't remember anything having left here other than that weak story about being president of Stanford, I hope you'll remember this one. Going back to 1972, these healthcare accounts, just over 1% of GDP. And look where they're headed on the current trend line. If we don't find a way to change course, they will consume 13% of GDP by 2050. And it's very hard to see from a budget perspective how you get well when one component is going up that dramatically. I mean, you put the two together, Social Security and the healthcare accounts, that's 19% of GDP. That's where we are in terms of all of federal spending if you look for the last 40 years. So we got a problem. Let me go to the next. In terms of unfunded liabilities of the federal government, you can see Social Security, $6.5 trillion. That's the 75-year shortfall according to the trustees. But look at Medicare, $24 trillion. Now that is real money. And we can't, even in Washington, that's real money. We just can't let this go unaddressed. Some of our colleagues say, well, repeal the health care law that was passed in President Obama's early part of his administration. Let me just say that I think that is a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea because the Congressional Budget Office tells us, and I quote, that enacting health care law repeal would increase federal deficits in the decade after 2019 by an amount that is in the broad range around 0.5% of GDP. Now let me just go to the next slide. 0.5% of GDP in the period 2020 to 2029 is $1.3 trillion. $1.3 trillion. That's not my estimate. That's the Congressional Budget Office telling us what happens if you repeal health care reform. Why is that? Because if you look at the Accountable Care Act, virtually every idea that anybody came to us from every philosophical stripe to get a hold of costs was put into the Accountable Care Act. Senator Judd Gregg, the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, and I wrote CBO in the midst of the debate and asked them, what are the biggest bang for the buck things we could do to rein in health care expenditures? And they wrote back to us and they said, first of all, you got to change the way you pay for health care. Instead of paying for procedures, you got to pay for performance. You got to pay for results. And that is in the health care reform law. Second thing they said, biggest bang for the buck, you got to change the tax treatment of health care. You cannot let it be treated as completely exempt, because what it does is encourages overutilization. So those things were put in the legislation. Let me go to the slide on revenue in the interest of time. Some of my colleagues have said, look, if you look at the last 40 years, average revenue is 18% of GDP, so that's all we need. I would just say to you, I don't think so. Because if you look at the 5 times we've balanced or been in surplus, revenue hasn't been at 18% of GDP. Revenue's been at 19.7, 19.9, 19.8, 20.6, 19.5. That's why in the Fiscal Commission, I argued for getting a base of 20.5% of GDP on revenue. That's not a popular position to take. But nor is reforming the entitlements. And I also argued strenuously, you got to deal with all of them. You got to deal with Social Security. You got to deal with Medicare. And yes, you've got to deal with defense. 51% of all federal employees are at the Department of Defense, and that does not count the contractors. When I asked the defense analysts before the Fiscal Commission, how many contractors are there at the Department of Defense? They said, Senator, we can't tell you. I said, is that a matter of classification? No, Senator, we don't know. We just had the Secretary of Defense before the Budget Committee 2 weeks ago, and I asked him, do we have any better insight on the number of contractors at the Department of Defense? He said, no, we don't. We got a contractor problem. And indeed we do. I asked them, how much does it cost to keep one soldier for 1 year in the field in Afghanistan? $840,000. I mean, I must say I was surprised by the answer. I try not to ask questions I don't know the answer to. I learned that much, Secretary Shultz, in Washington. I was expecting an answer of $600,000. But the controller of the Department of Defense answered without hesitation, $840,000. So what do we do about all this? I was part of the Fiscal Commission. In fact, Senator Gregg and I came up with the idea of a Fiscal Commission, tried to sell it to our colleagues. We offered it as legislation. We had 53 votes for it, but we needed 60. We had 7 of our original co-sponsors vote no when we voted. You think about that. It's never happened before that I know in the history of the United States Senate. To have 7 original co-sponsors vote no on a measure they were original co-sponsors for? I think we know why. Because they were scared. And they were threatened that if they voted for it, they were going to have primary opponents. But the Fiscal Commission was formed administratively when we couldn't get it formed legislatively. The Bowles-Simpson Commission, and I understand Alan Simpson was here last year. I served on it, was proud to serve on it. Senator Gregg, who was ranking Republican on the committee, served on it as well. We got 11 of 18 of the commissioners to support it. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. It's really the only bipartisan plan that has been able to garner that kind of support. So certainly not perfect. A lot of things in it I don't like. But as I told my staff, the only thing worse than being for this is being against it. Because we absolutely have to find a way forward. And if you look at where the savings came from, 24% of the savings came from reducing tax expenditures, which are now running $1.2 trillion a year. We are spending more through the tax code than we are all of the appropriated accounts. We got 24% of the savings from non-defense discretionary spending, 28% from defense discretionary spending, 17% from mandatory, and 7% from revenue other than tax expenditures, including a 15-cent gas tax, which I can tell you in my state is extremely unpopular. The tax reform in the Fiscal Commission was not done by raising tax rates. Just the opposite. We lowered tax rates to promote economic growth and improve America's competitive position. Made the tax code much simpler, 3 rates instead of 6, with a top rate of 28%, top corporate rate of 28%, down from 35%. One of the ways we were able to do that is to put capital gains and dividends at ordinary rates. Now, before anybody jumps out the window, nobody's doing, well, can't really jump out the window here. We're on the first floor. But understand that we said, if you want to have a differential, you got to buy it up in higher rates with everybody else. So if you're going to have a capital gains dividends differential, you got to buy up the 28% rate. We also reformed mortgage interest and charitable deductions. We preserved the child tax credit and EITC and repealed the alternative minimum tax, repealed it. And under that scenario, revenues do grow to 21% of GDP by 2022. So you bring down expenditures, and you raise revenue, and you get us back on track. Let me just conclude on this slide. What's the biggest impediment to our doing it? Public opinion. I know a lot of people say it's a lack of leadership. My experience, and I'm leaving at the end of this year, so, I don't need to give a political speech. But Congress pretty much reflects the people that sent them there. That's my observation. And when you ask the American people, you want to reduce Medicare benefits? 82% say no. You want to reduce cost of living increases to Social Security? 65% say no. You want to have some defense savings? 51% say no. You want to add 15 cents a gallon gas tax? 74% oppose. In fact, in the polling, it's very interesting. The American people support 2 things. 1, cutting foreign aid. Well, Secretary Shultz, nobody knows better than you. That's less than 1% of federal spending. When you're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar, taken on, you can eliminate all the foreign aid, you're not going to make a material difference. The other thing they will support is taxing the wealthy. Well, I personally believe those of us who are more fortunate are going to have to pay somewhat more. But I say this to you, you cannot solve this problem by just taxing the wealthy. It doesn't work. You're going to have a top rate of 70% on corporations, a top rate of 60-70% on individuals. That would do great things for our competitive position in the world. So this notion that you can do this in an easy way, you're going to just tax wealthy people, you're going to eliminate foreign aid, that is not going to solve this problem. This problem is too big. When you again, are borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that you spend, you're going to have to take on the places that are growing dramatically as a share of federal spending. And those are the mandatory entitlement programs, primarily health care, and you're going to have to look, I believe, to the revenue side. Not by raising rates, but by going after tax expenditures, which is just a different way of spending money than through the appropriated accounts. Let me stop there and thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I'm so loud.
You point this at. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, SIEPR, for inviting me here this afternoon for this event. I feel a little bit out of place with such a distinguished group of speakers, for after all, I'm just a former Senate staffer. And once a former Senate staffer, you always are, and you must show deference to the chairman of your former committee. So those of you who thought this was going to be a point-counterpoint debate, differing Republican Democratic viewpoints on the federal budget, you might be a little disappointed. I think you'll find that the chairman and I agree more than we disagree on the issues and the possible solutions. I know we're supposed to focus here on the long-term budget outlook, but recalling Winston Churchill's observation that the, quote, the further backward you look, the further forward you can see, I want to go back with you briefly before we go forward. And here the chairman and I may have not be in total agreement. So let's look backwards, then observe the present, and speculate a little bit about the future. This graph is in nominal dollars. It shows the recent history of our federal budget deficits or surpluses. About 40 years ago, in 1970, the deficit totaled a grand total of about $3 billion, but reached then the astonishing figure at that time of $74 billion in 1990. That was to become the basis, of course, for presidential candidate Ronald Reagan to campaign, in his campaign, to question President Carter's ability to control the deficit. In 1987, with the deficit standing at about $220 billion, a young freshman senator from North Dakota arrived on the Budget Committee, and Senator Conrad maintained that he would be a one-term senator unless the budget was balanced at the end of his first term. Now, fate would have it that the death of Senator Burdick, Quentin Burdick, the senior senator from North Dakota, in September of 1992 changed his plans, and the deficit then stood at $300 billion. But what I really want to look back and focus on here is the period when we actually did reach a surplus in this country, 1998 to 2001. As you can see from that chart, the red line is up into the actual surplus situation. If I were here in March of 2001, that red line, headed upward, would have continued off the charts as estimated not only by the Independent Congressional Budget Office, but by the outgoing Clinton administration and Alan Greenspan's Federal Reserve. In fact, the estimate was that between 2001 and 2011, last year, over that 10-year period, the federal government would run a $6 trillion surplus. And so to remove the drag on the fisc, the surplus, I do believe that surpluses can be as much a drag as deficits. Congress returned the projected surplus to the American public in the form of passing a 10-year tax cut in the spring of 2001. And President George W. Bush, of course, signed that law, and that law was extended last year and now expires at the end of this year. So we are living with the tax and fiscal policy decisions that were made 11 years ago, right now, today. In 2001, the tax cut was designed specifically not to put us back into a deficit situation. It reduced federal revenues by about 4% annually, but the fact is, as you all know, extenuating, unforeseen, catastrophic events of September 2001 changed our fiscal outlook overnight. And after reaching the largest surpluses in our modern history, things turned south. And along with the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008 and 2009, the trend of increasing debt and deficits has continued to this day. But what caused that $6 trillion to disappear in more detail? And can it tell us anything about the long term? As I said, in January 2001, we had a surplus projected for the next 10 years of about $6 trillion. That $6 trillion turned into a $6 trillion deficit over the same actual deficits, a $12 trillion swing. And what explains that swing? Legislative changes in policies account for about 70% of the swing. But note that legislated tax cuts, the tax cuts of 2001, 2002, and 2003, account for only 23% of the swing, while spending accounted for nearly half of the deficit increase. The unforeseen war-related expenditures explained about $1 trillion of the swing. And 30% of the swing, more than the tax cuts or more than the tax cuts plus the war spending combined, was simply explained by our inability to predict the path of the economy going forward. Lesson one, with all due respect to Michael Boskin and all the economists in the room. Lesson number one, be careful about long-term budget outlooks. They will be wrong because the economics will be wrong, or maybe more generous, they will have changed. And lesson number two, economists need to be humble. But here we are today, looking into a glass darkly. The deficit this year, as the Secretary pointed out, will exceed $1 trillion, 8.5% of GDP. And one path to the future depicted here is the President's recent proposals. If adopted, word for word, would result in deficits declining, as Ms. Tyson pointed out this morning, as a share of the economy, a good thing, to about 3%. But the accumulated debt held by the public would continue to grow and remain at an unsustainable level, growing to over 80% in 5 years. I agree with Laura Tyson's on this issue. The deficit comes down, but the debt continues to grow. And while I'm at it, I seem to recall, I don't know if he told you this last year, to the Secretary's point, when former Senator Simpson was here, he may have pointed out to you that who owns that debt, and it just so happens that we have a treaty with Taiwan. And that treaty with Taiwan is that if China were to attack Taiwan, we would have to go to war with China. We would have to borrow from China to go to war with China. Revenues under the President's proposal would grow nearly 10% over this period. And that's a level of growth in revenue. This is the President's proposal that we've not seen since 1995 or 2000 period. And similarly, spending would have to grow at less than 4%, a level of growth that we've not, in terms of spending growth, that we've not seen in the 1990s. It is highly unlikely, let's be honest, it's highly unlikely, of course, that in this politically charged year that the President's budget will be enacted word for word. It's not going to happen. So what about an alternative? What about maybe one of the Republican candidates running for president? I'm going to get myself in trouble here. Not my words, but the gentleman that probably should have been here in my place, the former Republican senator from New Hampshire, the former chairman of the Budget Committee, Judd Gregg, observed last week, and I quote, "On the issue of restoring our country's fiscal soundness, these candidates have so narrowed the options that if you calculate the actual adjustments that they could make to reduce the deficit, they would have virtually no effect." From my perspective, the critical issue of the future outlook, and I believe, again, I'm not picking on Ms. Tyson, I can't get to the future without going through the near-term present. My perspective is that the critical issue in the future outlook of the budget, and the chairman has mentioned, is the level of debt. Not necessarily the annual deficit figures, though, of course, those two are inextricably linked. And, oh, by the way, here at the academic mainstream of the world, I realize there is a challenge today to mainstream economists, neo-chartalism, modern monetary theory that says that because paper money is a creature of the state, governments have more flexibility so they can spend without regard to the taxes they collect and borrow without the fear of default. Consider myself to be old school mainstream today. I worry about debt. If you accept on this chart economic forecast averaging about 3% going out into the real growth out into the next 5 years, it appears that there's only one way to achieve a goal of reducing debt to a target of just 60% of GDP. I've given up in the rest of my lifetime for ever seeing a balanced budget again. I'd just be happy to reduce the level of debt to GDP. But if you try to get it to 60% of GDP, then I think that was the target set by the Bowles-Simpson Commission. That was the target set by a work that I did with my two former bosses, Senator Domenici and Alice Rivlin. And if you set that target, and by the way, that target is still about double the level of debt to GDP that we've had over the last 40 years, the way to achieve that it would be simply for Congress to go home and do nothing and put it on automatic pilot. Why? Because, as some of my colleagues refer to it as the path in the blue bars there, is the chart as Tax-mageddon, in which all tax cuts that expire at the end of this year do expire on schedule. The current AMT that we haven't extended yet for this year is not extended. The R&D tax credit, which we haven't extended, is not extended. The top tax rate of 15% on capital gains would revert back to the pre-2003 level of nearly 20%, and dividends at 39.6%. The recent payroll tax reduction that expires, that expired back at the end of February and was extended to the end of this year, it would also expire. And on the spending side, Medicare reimbursement rates to doctors, which we've kicked the can down the road again, would be reduced by 32% come next January. And then on top of all this chairman did not mention it, because of the failure of the super committee to come to an agreement last August, we would have another $1.2 trillion automatic across-the-board spending cuts triggered on January the 2nd, 2013. This is a pretty tough budget plan for the future, but one certainly does get your debt down to a level at least to 60% over this period of time. The worst alternative on this chart is the red bars, where as it relates to reducing the projected debt, we would simply extend all the tax cuts this December, eliminate the sequester next January, freeze the doc reimbursement rates at where they are today, and watch our debt burden explode, the red bars. And as you can see, the President's budget basically splits the difference between the two. What should we do? Maybe let's focus on the spending to reduce the projected debt. Again, the blue bars suggest that if we let the sequester take place and reduce, and this is in addition to what the President and Leon Panetta has already put forward, we would reduce defense spending and non-defense spending by another $900 billion over the next 10 years, and let the doctors' reimbursement rates be cut 32%. When we combine all those spending cuts with the significant tax increases, then, of course, we're on a path to reduce our debt. Interestingly, the last 40 years, federal spending, it's been mentioned a number of times already today, but federal spending as a share of our economy has averaged 21%. Today it stands at 24%. Could we squeeze 3% of GDP out of spending over the next decade to approach a debt to GDP figure of about 60% as a goal? Squeezing 3% of GDP would mean approximately $6 trillion in additional spending, federal spending. Not likely to happen for a major reason, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. But also note that even the super committee was only charged with finding $1.2 trillion over the same period. Okay, what about revenues? Over the last 40 years, revenues as a share of our economy have averaged about 18%. of GDP. And today, revenues are averaging, has been pointed out already, about 16%. And the President proposes to have revenues average close to 21% over the next decade, 3 percentage points higher than the 40-year average. Once again, if we were to let the 2001 tax cuts expire at the end of this year, revenues would increase each year, the blue bars increasing to about 21%, again 3 percentage points higher. While the President's proposal does significantly increase revenues, the green line in this chart, he nonetheless did not assume that the tax cuts for those under 250 would change. But again, in this politically charged year, increasing taxes on whomever it is unlikely, and talk of reforming the tax code, which I am all supportive of, tends to fall into the revenue neutral category, and therefore, unless combined with significantly more spending cuts than are already out there in our future, debt would continue to grow. So what's the solution? Gene Sterling, many of you know, a budget tax wonk, wrote sometime past that never in the nation's history have dead and retired public officials been so able to exert such control over the current federal budget and future budgets. And this slide, as the chairman has already pointed out, makes the case in spades. 50%, 2/3 of the budget if you throw in interest payments. 50% of the budget is basically spent just on 3 programs: Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And for all practical purposes, we have already frozen, under the budget agreement we reached last fall, we've already frozen defense spending over the next 10 years and non-defense appropriated accounts, the investment gap that Ms. Tyson talked about this morning, the seed corns of our future, education, research, that has already been frozen in law for the next 10 years. I said earlier that one of the lessons of the past was that in terms of long-term budget projections will be wrong. Let me make an adjustment to that, a caveat to that statement. I am certain of one projection, and that is that everyone in this room will be 10 years older 10 years from today, or we won't be here. And that's the problem. Unfortunately, unless we agree to raise taxes to match the growth in spending in these 3 programs that are driven by demographics and increasing health care costs, or if we can slow the aging process, unlikely, or change the rate of growth in these programs, I'm afraid we are destined to a future of debt that can only weaken the economy and our standard of living to the future. It comes down to this, ladies and gentlemen. Voters must choose, as the chairman has suggested. Voters must choose whether they prefer generous entitlement spending, and let's be clear what we're talking about, health care, coupled with higher taxes to pay for that, or modest public health care spending with lower taxes. So far, as the chairman's last chart pointed out, they seem to want no changes in Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, and no increases in taxes. This is two of my old bosses. My first boss was Alice Rivlin when this Congressional Budget Office was established, and Senator Domenici. This is their favorite chart, and was presented to the Super Committee last fall. It is public health care spending, stupid, that is driving spending in the outlook, long-term budget outlook. And this even assumes, Mr. Chairman, that the Health Care Reform Act is carried out. It's a difficult issue. Domenici and Rivlin, and most recently, and was discussed briefly this morning, Ryan and Wyden, and now Coburn and Purr, have reignited a debate over a fundamental change here to the way that the federal Medicare program would operate in the future by proposing to effectively set a cap on the government's contribution to premiums and allowing private plans to bid for the seniors' business. And today that federal government, on an average basis, about every Medicare recipient receives about $12,200 from the federal government. It's a controversial proposal. The opponents will argue that it shifts too much of the cost burden onto the recipients. But unless that archaic fee-for-service reimbursement system, unless it's not changed, until we begin to reimburse on the basis of quality of service, not quantity of services, and unless we as citizens who can afford it make an opportunity to take more responsibility for paying for our own health care, then I do not see how the rate of growth in federal spending, particularly in health care, will ever be controlled. And why is this so important? Not only to the federal budget, but as businessmen and women, it probably is most obvious to you. In a recent study by two economists, Stephen Nye and Sylvester Schieber, they demonstrated that rising health care benefits have been consuming a growing share of the wages, a phenomena that is most pronounced, particularly for those low-wage, unskilled workers that we talked about. We know that the key to rising standards of living over time rests with the increase in worker productivity. But the economists found that the insurance premiums, reflected by the growth in health care costs, grew at 2 to 3 times faster than productivity during the last decade, absorbing a share. This data here is amazing to me, that for a full-time, full-year worker that received health care benefits through their own employer, astonishingly to me at least, health care benefit costs represented nearly 50% of the wages of the lower decile workers between 2000 and 2009. If health care costs continue a growing share of productivity growth and exceed productivity growth, in theory, employers have to reduce benefit coverage, which will not be allowed under the new health care reform bill. They may drop coverage and pay the penalty for not providing coverage and shift those employees over onto the exchanges, driving up the federal cost, or maintain benefits and reduce cash wages, unlikely. The latter, not likely that you'll cut wages. Therefore, the worst of all outcomes, reduce payrolls. And indeed, the economists concluded that this rising health care cost about 2 percentage points in unemployment over the last few years. Let me close on a much different note. I am sorry that Chairman Conrad will be retiring later this year. He's still a young man. I am sorry that Chairman Gregg retired 2 years ago. I am sorry that Senators Bingaman, Nelson, Kyle, Snow, and so many others have decided to pack it in. But while the reasons will vary for their decision, it seems clear to me that one of the reasons is depicted by this chart, and that is the significant increase in polarization in the Congress. I'm not a political scientist. I trust the authors of this study have developed the appropriate metric for measuring the degree of polarization in the Congress. But I do not believe that one can fully address the long-term budget outlook in a partisan environment. It will require compromise on both sides. It will require more revenues than has been the historical average over the last 40 years. It will require fundamental changes in the way benefits are determined and delivered for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But one last thing. In the midst of what some consider to be a level of discourse in Congress that is the lowest ever and the highest level of partisanship, I think it's worth reminding ourselves it could be worse, and it has been worse. As we look back on the 150th anniversary of our own dark period, the Civil War, we should remember that the weapons of today, filibusters, recess appointments, finger-pointing, PACs, super PACs, are no match to a cane to the skull. In 1856, the country was very deeply divided over slavery, and the Senate's most notorious case of assault captured the nation's attention and accelerated us toward the Civil War. This is a congressman now, Preston Brooks, Democrat from South Carolina, crossed over the rotunda, over the Capitol, into the United States Senate and on the United States Senate floor in defending his relative, Senator Butler, another Democrat from South Carolina, upon whom Senator Charles Sumner, from a Republican from Massachusetts, had in the previous day unleashed an unmerciful verbal attack. Congressman Brooks repeatedly struck Sumner in the head with his cane, splintering the cane until he was semi-conscious, and staff will point you out on the floor of the United States Senate the nicks and marks in the desk that's still there to this day. Sumner spent the next 3 years recovering before he even returned to the Senate. And his desk on the Senate floor remained empty the entire time. and became the powerful symbol for a house divided over the issue of slavery. We are a divided country today along many fronts: red, blue states, the federal budget, taxes, social issues, contraception, health care. But just as the country came together following that dark period in our history, I truly believe, in fact, I pray, we will also find a solution to these difficult issues, and the long-term budget outlook will be positive for all Americans going forward. Thank you.